Hi again. Let's talk about Isaiah. Um, there are ways, especially this idea of the um, the advocacy on part of the poor, that our passage here in Luke chapter 1 makes me think about the prophet Isaiah. And I think one of the things you're probably picking up is that in the Magnificat, we have a little slice, a very important slice, that gives us access to all kinds of important biblical themes that run throughout both Old and New Testaments. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, and then verse 17. In fact, I probably should have done this already, but let me give you the page number if you're following along in the Bible we've prescribed for you. You're going to be looking at page 971. In the book of Isaiah chapter 2, we see this same kind of theme, that God advocates for, or he does something on behalf of those who are lowly. And certainly Mary says much the same thing. For instance, in verse 48, he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Now, we're going to come back in subsequent lectures to this idea about servanthood. Servanthood in the Hebrew Bible, being the servant of Yahweh, or Jehovah, if you're used to that language, or of just the Lord. They all are the same thing in the Hebrew Bible. To be the servant of the Lord, that's actually an exalted title. So Mary here recognizes something significant going on with her. Part of the focus that we see in the prophets especially, so Israel's prophets, Isaiah, that we're talking about now, he's a biggie. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then you've got guys like Hosea or Amos. I'm going to talk a little bit about Amos. We see that there's a really strong emphasis on the part of the prophets on justice, that God encourages people to act justly with one another. In fact, here at Azusa Pacific University, this particular academic year, we have delved into Micah chapter 6, verse 8 as kind of a university passage. If you're not aware of that, you should be made aware of it. So Micah asks, he's shown you, O man, what the Lord requires of you. And what is it? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So the focus on justice in that Micah passage is something that we see running throughout different prophetic books. Now, they don't all say the same thing, but I would say this. If you're not familiar with the prophets, because of that word prophet and the way it's used in our kind of common language, we think it's about foretelling the future. It's really not. The prophets in Israel were really the preachers of the day. So they were the ones that were offering correctives. They were the ones advising kings sometimes, but they were the truth tellers. They were the ones telling truth to power. And that's a service that they performed for Israel's ruling class, but certainly for the people as well, as they would advocate, as they understood God to be advocating and on the side of the poor. This is something that I think will impact your nursing practice, because we don't always get the clients in business or the patients that we want. When I was a pastor, I didn't always get, the kind of congregation that I thought I should have, but I got the congregation that God thought I needed. And they were good for me, and I learned from them. But sometimes they brought real challenges to the church. They could be economic challenges. They could be psychological challenges. I pastored churches in places that were not always what's the right word? The most together localities that one could see. So anyway, we as people, we are needy, and God recognizes that through the voice of the prophets. I would also point you to Isaiah chapter 58 as Isaiah redefines what it means to fast. When we think of fasting, and of course you're familiar with fasting, blood work, and all that. We think of not eating. Isaiah redefines fasting in chapter 58. I would encourage you to look at that and see how he redefines it in relation to the poor. So let's go on over and talk about the book of Amos for a minute, because once we start talking about the poor and we talk about God and his perspective on the poor in the Old Testament as revealed through the prophets, we cannot skip the book of Amos. All of Israel's prophets are interested in the treatment of the poor, I think, or the maltreatment thereof, but Amos especially so. The prophet hammers the point home over and over again that God is on the side of the poor. In fact, in chapter 2, he criticizes those in Israel who, in the words of the prophet, pant after the very dust of on the head of the poor, and or sell the needy for a pair of sandals, right? So even that which is of very little value, the dust on the head, I think that's the most extreme case, or the day-to-day sandals that get ripped up through use, even that has been regarded by these rich guys as being worth something if they can just extract a little bit more from the poor. In fact, in chapter 4, verse 1, Amos speaks to the rich of the land, and in this time, the best cows were the cows of an area called Bashan. And Amos says this in chapter 4, verse 1, "Hear, O cows of Bashan." Now, he's not speaking literally to cows. He's talking to the refinery of the land, and he engages them in a kind of lawsuit. This is what God's going to do to you because of the way you mistreated the poor. When I read the Magnificat, I hear that kind of emphasis, that kind of language come through. Now, I know that your patients are not always going to be poor. They're not always going to be rich. Many of them are middle class. But when we are sick, in some sense, we really are poor. We're vulnerable. Whether it's cancer treatment, the emergency room, renal failure, whatever it would be. When we're sick like that, we're poor. We're at the mercy, if you will, of somebody else or of something that's invaded us. And I think that provides a way of thinking about the Magnificat that is a helpful application of this text, particularly for the service of nursing. So that's it right now for some of the Old Testament backgrounds in specific text, but the next time we'll talk specifically a little bit about the exile. I made a mention earlier of the land. I want to talk about exile for just a moment.